Hello, beautiful community. Sub-community, of course, because we're on the philosophy channel. I want to give us a bit of a warning about the eruption of cultural discourse about the issue of free will that you're seeing everywhere. Because of my health, I've sadly been too short on time to follow it. But it's very important to give ourselves a bit of grounding, for those of you who are interested, about what the hell this conversation is about, in my opinion, because the extent of misunderstanding out there in the culture is almost comical. So we're going to start with this. The question of free will is not a question for scientists to comment on. And scientists are no more qualified to comment on that question than pianists or accountants or tennis players or rugby players. And that's because the question of free will doesn't really question what science tells us. It begins by admitting whatever is our latest naturalistic understanding of ourselves. So, what does physics tell us in 2023? We're going to ask the scientific community. We're going to check with the scientific community. Their view of that is not too wonky. And we are going to start with that rather than question it. So scientists would be involved in the question of free will if the question got involved in what science tells us. But the free will question outsources what science tells us to scientists and just starts with that. And then it goes on to ask what are really two absolutely vital questions, and they're distinct questions. One, are our concepts of action compatible with our best naturalistic understanding of ourselves? In other words, is you talking about Ricky, who's outside of the couch now, so he is safe. If you're new here, Ricky has a recurrent appearance on the channel here in our examples. Ricky decides to go to the bakery because Ricky is reading the New York Review of Books, and Ricky realizes you can't read the New York Review of Books without eating a muffin. So he goes to the bakery. Is Ricky deliberating about going to the bakery and deliberating about what to buy at the bakery incompatible with physics? One question. Are our concepts of action incompatible with what science tells us about the world, what science tells us about neurophysiology too, or not? Second question is, are our ethical concepts that we use compatible or incompatible with what science tells us about the world? So Ricky is now reading the New York Review of Books. Ricky reads an article in New York Review of Books with the muffin, blueberry muffin, very nice muffin, chocolate chips in there as well. And Ricky says, oh my word, this article confirms to me that this thing that's sitting there in the Kremlin is profoundly irresponsible as a political leader. He is a grossly unethical political leader. He is illegitimate. And if I were a citizen of his country and I really understood what was going on, I'd be ashamed of my political association to government like that. Is this incompatible with what science tells us? Ricky's made a negative judgment ethically about Mr. Putin. Ricky's made some political judgments too there that Mr. Putin is not legitimate. Ricky's talked about the appropriateness of certain sentiments that are absolutely sentiments in the moral sphere, like shame. Is all of that stuff compatible or incompatible with physics? there isn't a conversation here for a scientist. And it doesn't matter how brilliant a scientist you are. It doesn't matter how brilliant a political philosopher I am. I will be easily defeated on military strategy by somebody who is averagely good at it. So, being brilliant at stuff doesn't run all the way down. And it's not a condemnation of a scientist to say that he or she don't know what they're talking about when it comes to free will. If they've got a PhD in philosophy, maybe we can talk. But it's not a criticism. It's something on the contrary. It's us saying that we're not questioning science in this conversation. We're just saying, here's what science tells us. And if we want to clarify that a bit more, we're going to ask scientific community. And then we're going to say, what's going on with our concepts of action? What's going on with our ethical concepts, and are they compatible? Now, the answer to that question is an answer for anybody who wants to do philosophy at the kitchen table. So I don't want to impose that answer on you. For entertainment's value, I can tell you what my answer is. All human concepts of action are compatible with not just what science tells us today, but anything that science could ever tell us. Right? There's absolutely no conflict between the concept of decision or deliberation or rational choice and anything that science could ever tell us about the world. Just no conflict there at all. In other words, there is no meaningful sense in which it's interesting to tell Susan as she crosses the road to go, and meet a friend at the cafe that the idea that she made a decision about this is incompatible with science. There is no sense in which that's interesting. And it's a bit more complex with ethical concepts. And I think that here I'm with the great philosopher Bernard Williams. I simply say the ethical concepts we need are compatible with science. Then there are certain ethical concepts, certain interpretations of ethical concepts that are a bit metaphysically ambitious, and those may indeed clash with what science tells us. If they imply some kind of truly radical sense of could have done otherwise, for example, that we don't need for our everyday ethical life. But that's going to be my answer. It doesn't matter what my answer is. What matters is that this is a conversation about basically decision theory and basically ethical reflection on ethical concepts, and whether there is going to be a clash between that and our best naturalistic understanding of ourselves. Final remark is that in the ancient world, they used to bring together the concept of political freedom and free will, and we don't do that anymore. And that's largely because we don't accept stuff that they used to believe about human beings. They thought that some human beings were better than others in a way that we find outrageously prejudicial. So in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, they would have thought that women were reflectively inferior to men. That they had different faculties of the mind. And as a result of that, they couldn't do certain tasks in society. Because they couldn't think properly and so on. And we just don't believe that anymore. And therefore, for us, the conversation really isn't at all tied to politics or to political questions, like coercion or brainwashing or whatever else. If you're not free in a political or moral sense because you're brainwashed or coerced, it's got nothing to do with free will. That's to say, our answers to the question of the relationship between our concepts of action and our ethical concepts to a best scientific understanding of ourselves remains the same, whether our context is North Korea or Denmark. Lots of love and talk soon.